All right, I think we're going to begin now. So hello to everyone. To those of you who joined us for yesterday's discussion with Attorneys General, welcome back. For those just joining us today, welcome to Women and Democracy. Ms. Magazine's quarterly multimedia platform provides deep expert analyses on issues impacting full and fair representation. Today's recorded discussion with Secretaries of State will be published later this month for the September installment called Women Saving Democracy. For anyone who missed yesterday's discussion with Attorneys General, that will be published on the platform as well. This quarter, the platform is created in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice and with RepresentWomen. A few quick notes before we get started. We're very pleased to have a closely held invitation-only audience with us here today. We really welcome your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box, and I'll choose a few of them near the end to pose to our speakers. Because the event is hosted by all 501c3 organizations, the panelists will not be taking any position on any active political races or candidates. And for any journalist friends who happen to be with us, today's discussion is off the record. Once the full Women in Democracy site goes live on September 20th, you are welcome to share. In addition to this panel recording, the full site will include an aligned essay series and episodes of Ms. Studio's podcasts on the issues with Michelle Goodwin and 15 Minutes of Feminism. We'll also follow up and provide links for promoting the platform on social media. And last but not least, we're very grateful to the sponsors for this Women in Democracy installment. That's Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Thank you for your support on the issues that matter so much to all of us. I'd now like to welcome three very inspiring women leaders to the floor. Secretaries of State Tahesha Way from New Jersey, Secretary of State Shenna Bellows from Maine, and Secretary of State Leigh Chapman from Pennsylvania. Secretary Way, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Gary. I tell you, this is a wonderful day in which we can convene my colleagues, myself, to really, discuss democracy. And I am so privileged to serve alongside these two phenomenal, dynamic leaders who are in the front lines, ensuring that eligible voters can cast their ballots safely and, of course, with integrity. So I know there's a lot for us to discuss, but before we dive into it, I just want to thank our host, the Brennan Center, RepresentWomen, and of course, Ms. Magazine. So my first question to my esteemed colleagues is for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a Secretary of State. Now, we all should understand there's no cookie cutter approach to this. I know for myself, I was not that 5-year-old little girl saying, when I grow up, I want to be Secretary of State or president or even like mayor of my town. I just know my journey was one where, I met individuals who stood for justice. I became involved in, organizations which stood up, especially for the rights of women. And of course, I, became a state judge overseeing election contested cases, and I ran for public office years ago. So, that inspired me to pursue the office of Secretary of State. So I'm going to start with my neighbor from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to just give her.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Secretary Way. And like you, I didn't think I was going to be Secretary of State. And I was actually just appointed in January. So I've been on the job less than a year. But when it comes to my path, I am an attorney by background and have really dedicated my career to civil rights, racial justice, and just making sure that every eligible American in this country can register to vote, cast their ballot, and have it counted. So it's a passion of mine. Ever since I graduated from Howard University School of Law, one thing that we learned when we were there as a student, we learned about the great Charles Hamilton Houston. And one thing that he said was, a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. So I really took that to heart and, worked for nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations that were focused on, helping historically marginalized communities vote and have access to the ballot box and remove some of these systemic barriers that we've seen around the country, in recent years. So I've worked at the federal level, trying to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I've worked in various states around the country, from Nevada to Florida. I was part of the team that sued the state of Wisconsin over their voter ID law. Worked here in Pennsylvania as policy director for Governor Wolf 7 years ago. And so he asked me to come back to Pennsylvania in January, lead elections and really see the state through the 2022 midterm elections. So it's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be really on the front lines, fighting for democracy at a time where it's so pivotal, when there's so much at stake, and, really just working to make sure that all voters have access to the ballot box.
Great. Secretary Bellows, your journey?
I'm just so inspired, awe-inspired listening to both of you. My path was a little bit different. I'm not an attorney. I grew up poor, without electricity or running water until I was in the 5th grade in Hancock, Maine. And I thought politics was fascinating, and I loved the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I literally had a poster of the Bill of Rights on my bedroom wall. And one of the highlights of my childhood was when my dad took me to a state convention, and I got to meet then Senator George Mitchell and run an errand for him. So I was hooked. I went on to Peace Corps, AmeriCorps Vista, and I was hired by the National American Civil Liberties Union to be an organizer, and working with them in their Washington legislative office, advocated on a number of civil rights and voting rights act issues, and then moved back home to Maine to be executive director of the ACLU of Maine. In that capacity, I led a number of statewide initiatives. I was one of the leaders of Maine's marriage equality campaign. It was a wonderful coalition. And then co-chaired Maine's statewide campaign for same-day voter registration. I decided to run for elected office because I was frustrated with some of the advocacy directed toward policymakers, and policymakers not always being responsive to the experts or the advocates. And I first ran unsuccessfully for US Senate in 2014 against then Susan Collins, and then I ran successfully for my state Senate seat in 2016. I served in the state Senate for 4 years, and Maine is a little bit different as well. The Secretary of State is elected by the legislature, not by the people, not appointed by the governor. So we have term limits, and our former secretary was term limited out, and the Secretary of State position was open in 2020. And I really wanted to run because I'm passionate about democracy and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and voting rights. And I had people say, don't do it, you'll never win. And then finally I had a friend say, why are no women running when no women have served in Maine for 200 years as Secretary of State? And I said, well, I wanted to, I thought about it. And she said, you should run, I'll help you. And that was what turned the page for me to run for Secretary of State and be elected Maine's first female Secretary of State.
Wow, I applaud that too. We have various conversations, in which we discuss our best practices and lean on one another. And just hearing your experiences, both Secretary Chapman and yours, Secretary Bellows, I think is, so awe-inspiring. And especially the one thing that resonates is the perseverance that each of you have had in your experiences, and of course, how you parlay that now into your roles of Secretaries of State. So Maine and Pennsylvania are definitely in good hands when it comes to her democracies. However, I was actually on, I should say I delivered a lunch presentation yesterday to a company. I'll, keep that there. But what was important out of the conversation was a question that was asked of me that I am going to ask to both of you. And I'm going to start this time with Secretary Bellows. The question was, being a woman, and in terms of you, Secretary Chapman, just like me, a woman of color, what barriers or challenges have you faced in your career and in getting to where you are now? Secretary Bellows, if you want to start.
What a great question. And I can't wait to hear how you answer that as well. I'm very curious. I think, I love when young people come to the State House or the Secretary of State's office. I give them tours of the Capitol, and I tell them that it's really important to believe in yourself and follow your dreams. And that is so corny, but I talk about my background, having grown up poor, and I had a speech impediment. I had a lisp. I had years of school-based speech therapy. Thank you, public schools. And I had teachers and mentors along the way who helped me. So I think for me, those were a few early barriers where I had supports that helped me overcome those. As a woman, sexism, unfortunately, is still alive and well. And I think that sometimes when we aspire to higher office, for example, when I was considering running for Secretary of State, one of the charges against me is, oh, you're just doing this because you're so ambitious, as if ambition is a bad thing, or aspiration to make positive policy change is a bad thing. But that is something that is used to denigrate and undermine female candidates. I think also women as candidates. I remember when I first ran for US Senate, I had a tremendous amount of negative backlash saying, you don't look like a potential US Senator. You need to, and I think comments on appearances and that sort of that judgment that happens is definitely a factor of gender. I don't think men get told that they don't look like US senators or secretaries or whatnot. So those are just a couple of the barriers. And I think it's important to find your networks of support, like we have among our secretaries of state, your friendships and support, even though we only meet once or twice a year in person, has been really important, I think, in this journey.
Secretary Chapman.
I'm going to answer your question in a little bit different way. So one thing that grounds me every day as I come to work doing this job is just knowing what my background is, knowing where my moral and my values are, and really just showing up and being my authentic self every single day at work. And a lot of times that's reflected in the decisions I make every day. I bring my life experience with me. I bring the fact that I was a voting rights attorney for 10 years, that I, saw firsthand people who were shut out of the ballot box because of their race or their gender or their age or their income status. I put people on the witness stand. I had a witness in Wisconsin who was over 90 years old, and her daughter had to spend $2,000 in legal fees for her to get a birth certificate in order for her to get an ID to vote. So, I've met, people who have been impacted around voter disenfranchisement, and it's a real thing. So every single day I carry that with me, and I make decisions that will make our democracy better for everyone. So it's really important that whenever there's barriers being thrown up, or if people, sometimes we have to make decisions that not everyone agrees with, that aren't popular, but they're right. And they're right for voters. They're right for our state. They're right for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And, I'm really comforted in that decision making because of my life experience. And because I know every decision I'm making is grounded in promoting democracy and access.
So true. And I'm going to try to answer the question too, Secretary Bellows, since you asked it of me in terms of any obstacles. And I think similar to you. And I think Secretary Chapman has seen it too, the being underestimated. I look back at even when I was an attorney like you, Secretary Chapman, walking into legal proceedings, right? And everyone looked and said, okay, who are you? And I would even say Tahesha Way for plaintiff such and such. And they still would ask me, so are you the attorney on this case?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was one of the things. Then even when I was a state judge and I donned my Supergirl, I called it robe, walking into the legal proceedings, and I would get the look like, that's the judge kind of thing. And of course, you know, as female leaders, you know, you take that and you say to yourself, okay, but we know how to juggle. We know how to organize. I'm a mom of 4 girls, and I, you know, tell them all the time, you may get underestimated, but just as my mom would always say to me, just be present and just know your value, because when you're walking into the room or walking into the career, you are going to have to contribute positively, know who you are, and of course, you know, do it in the name of others to better their lives and their situations. And I am so honored, and I thank the 2 of y'all for voting for me, you know, in becoming NAS president, because I think that that was one of the most meaningful experiences when you look at how the organization has been founded 118 years ago. And I was the first African-American president, Secretary of State, to land as president. And I know there'll be many more, but to be female and have done that, that to me is even more significant and important. So I know that it's also a good thing that we do have this network of female secretaries. I know that a female Secretary of State put me in the pipeline of leadership at the National Association of Secretaries of State, and that too is meaningful. So moving on. I know we're saying, oh, we're Secretaries of State, you know, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maine, but do people really know what we do? I know I go into various schools, and even in the high schools, I'll walk in and I'm Secretary of State, and they think that my role and responsibilities, I'm Condoleezza Rice, and I say that respectfully. They look at it because they hear on the federal level that that is what I am doing. So I didn't have to explain to them the role of the state Secretary of State, with the understanding that yes, the majority of us serve as the chief election officers of our state, but there are different nuances and different portfolios. So tell us about your job and its critical role in strengthening and protecting democracy, and also help us demystify the role of the responsibilities that you may have as being your Secretary of State in your respective government. I'll start with you, Secretary Chapman.
Sure. I often get that too. A lot of people are confused as far as what Secretaries of State are. So I'm appointed by the governor. I believe I'm one of 5 Secretaries of State that are appointed that also are chief election officials. So I am the person who oversees the election for the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We have 67 counties in Pennsylvania, so we provide support to the counties. We issue guidance and directives and make sure that they are, you know, operating elections in accordance with the law in Pennsylvania. But I also have a whole nother portfolio of work as well. The largest being I'm responsible for professional licensure in Pennsylvania. So we license 900,000 professionals in the state. And it's everyone from real estate agents to nurses to doctors, you know, to people, salesmen of cars. I mean, it's really runs the gamut. Hairdressers, barbers, you know. So it's 900,000 people that I'm responsible for licensing them. I am also over charities and corporate registration, lobbying disclosure, and campaign finance. So It's a lot. I also have to advertise constitutional amendments, which we have frequently now in Pennsylvania. And I'm over mixed martial arts and professional wrestling and kickboxing as well. So I have a lot under my jurisdiction. And, you know, while elections really is all consuming right now, it's really one of the smallest departments. We only have around less than 20 full-time staff on elections, and we're overseeing 67 counties, which is something that we've been advocating more of because we need to have more staff to make sure that we are, you know, doing all the robust work to support counties to make sure we're certifying voting systems. Because although Pennsylvania is the 5th largest state, or Commonwealth, I should say, our elections office is one of the smallest, and North Dakota, Rhode Island, Idaho are the states that have smaller elections offices than ours. So we're really trying to advocate with the legislature to provide more funding so we can hire more staff as elections go on.
Right, wonderful to hear. Martial arts. Okay. All righty, Secretary Bellows.
So I'm sitting actually at a Bureau of Motor Vehicles office because, and perhaps this is why it's so confusing for people because different secretaries in different states do different things. I oversee the Bureau of Motor Vehicles for the state of Maine. And then I also oversee corporations and charities. I oversee the Maine State Archives. So as Secretary of State of Maine, I am responsible for all of the state records of Maine, both archival records and then also records that may be at some point destroyed because they don't have archival value. So there's that history piece there that I really love. And then, of course, elections, which is so fundamental to everything else that we care about. I came today over from a 2-day training that we're doing for our municipal clerks. Maine, like many of the New England states, in contrast to much of the rest of the country, administers elections at the municipal level. So our little tiny towns are running the federal elections this year. And so we need to train those 500 plus clerks and deputy clerks and warden and registrars to make sure that they understand their responsibilities. And then we provide support to them. We also do ballot design, we approve polling locations. There's a lot that goes into we secure a statewide lease for all of the voting equipment that we then send out to the towns. So there is a lot that goes into being the chief elections official and protecting democracy.
Yes, there is. And, you know, the one thing about the Secretary of State position, as both of you are highlighting with your respective portfolios, is it is a very essential position governmentally because it touches upon the overall quality of life of our residents in terms of culture, arts, history, economy, and of course, our elections. And speaking of elections, because I know we're progressing in time, can you speak of the top 2 or 3 things that you feel are jeopardizing election administration right now? I'll start with you again, Secretary Chapman.
Great. So I think the first thing that's really jeopardizing election administration is mis and disinformation. That's something that we've seen frequently since the 2020 election in all different forms, especially on social media platforms, from TikTok to Twitter to Facebook to YouTube, all different ways. There's all different ways that this misinformation and disinformation has spread in recent years. And just a few months ago, we actually had an incident in Pennsylvania where someone tweeted that mail-in voting was illegal, which we all know mail-in voting is not illegal. It was actually upheld by the state Supreme Court here a few months ago, and it's the law of the land. So at the Department of State, we work with the social media companies to make sure that we're correcting that information, that we're getting accurate and trusted information out to voters, that we're working with stakeholders as well to try to prohibit voter confusion as much as possible. So that's something that we're continuing to tackle, as we move into 2022 general election in just under 2 months. The other thing I would say is our threats to election workers. and also just staffing. In Pennsylvania, we've had over 35 election workers leave their posts since the 2020 election. And some of it has been because of planned retirements or just, changes in roles, but some of it has actually been because of threats to election workers. There has been a recent emergence of threats, since the 2020 election against election workers just for doing their jobs, just for making sure that every single vote is counted, which is, the pillar of democracy. We need to make sure that every single vote in an election is counted and that voters are not disenfranchised. But unfortunately, election workers have been threatened, their families have been threatened. So some people have left the job. So that's been a challenge because anytime you're getting new people in, you have to train them. You have to make sure they're up to speed and that they know everything that they need to do as far as roles and responsibilities. And we've had people leave just as recent as a few weeks ago. So, it's incumbent on us as a Department of State to make sure that they are supported as they transition into their new roles.
So true. Secretary Bellows?
I was just going to echo that. I could not agree more. And the disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation is so dangerous because when people believe lies about the elections, when they believe that election officials do not have integrity, which they do. They are so hardworking. They work so hard to make sure that every voter can register to vote, cast their ballot, and have their ballot be counted. But when people believe lies, that leads to threatening behavior and hostility directed toward those election officials. And the other trend that we're seeing, and I know both of you are seeing this in your states as well, is now, because of disinformation and lies about the elections, we are seeing Freedom of Information Act requests, records requests being weaponized. Someone recently called it a denial of service attack. Essentially, every hour that election officials are spending responding to cut and paste ridiculous queries that are being spread by QAnon or Telegram or some of these fringe websites is an hour they can't spend on election administration. It's very stressful. And I share your concerns about staffing and training. At this training, we have a mix. We have veterans who've been in doing elections for decades. But increasingly, as I was meeting people and asking them, how long have you been with us? It was since July, since April, since 2021. And they're committed, they're eager, they're getting the training, they're going to do a good job. But that type of transition brings with it some challenges as well. So it's unfortunately, the veterans tell me it's a very different environment than it was just 4 years ago. And while I myself haven't experienced election threats, perhaps because I wasn't secretary in 2020, I know clerks that have. And when I talked to other secretaries who were present overseeing elections in 2020 and some of how they were targeted, it's really terrifying.
Indeed, everything that both of you are saying is poignant because I'll start with the election threats. And I feel for election workers because they're the front lines of our democracy. I don't think that anyone realizes the hours, as civil servants. Now they come in and no one's asking the clerk staff or the board staff, what is your political affiliation? No, they are just coming in just to serve the public. And then to have to be exposed to these threats, it's just, it's not a good feel for our society and indeed for our nation. And of course, like Secretary Chapman, you mentioned you have a small election staff. I know I have a small one too, about 10 to 12 workers. And just to retain these workers is, now everyone is saying, okay, well, what benefit is it to us if we're just trying to do our job? as guardians of democracy, and that's all they're trying to do. I know that another concern oftentimes becomes how our bench of poll workers is decreasing too. And we want to, of course, be able to run elections. So we do need the committed poll workers out there. But when you have the misinformation, it really deters folk to not only say, I want to work in this election space, but again, why should I trust the integrity of all of these election processes? So everything you're saying is true, but my ask to each and every one of you, and I'm going to start with you, Secretary Bellows, on this is, can you give us some of the examples of some of the best practices, some of the strategies which you and your team is utilizing to address all of this that is going on?
So we just passed legislation in Maine to protect election workers, to make it a state level election crime to threaten election workers. Now, with my background at the ACLU, I am not a huge fan of new crimes because for a lot of different reasons. But what I will say is we made it Class E, which is one of the lower level crimes in terms of lengths of prison sentences or that sort of thing. But by elevating it to the state level, it brings to bear the investigative and prosecutorial authority of the state and the Attorney General's office so that we can bring our resources to investigate any challenges to our election. We're also doing training. We're doing de-escalation training for clerks because sometimes these threats are people who are being hostile in the moment, and we can use traditional de-escalation techniques to bring people down, hopefully. And then we are doing some of the things that we do every election. So it really trying to stay focused, as Secretary Chapman was saying earlier, stay focused on our values, our morals, and our goals, right? So our goal is to make sure that every Maine citizen 18 years or older can register to vote, cast their ballot, and have it be counted. And in Maine, you never lose your right to vote. Literally every Maine citizen has the right to vote. And so we're doing things like we just implemented automatic voter registration at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So when people come to get their license or update their license, they can register to vote automatically in that moment. We have an online absentee ballot tracking system now so that if people want to request an absentee ballot, they can then track its progress and make sure that it's getting back and that it's getting counted by the clerk. And then there's some things that we've done for a long time, like same-day voter registration, plug for that, and a 30-day period of no excuse absentee voting. So anyone can go vote in person 30 days prior to the election at their municipal office because we want to make it convenient, accessible, and secure for everyone.
Great. Secretary Chapman?
Sure, as Secretary Bellows is talking, she has the wish list of everything that we would like to implement in Pennsylvania. And you know, we are continuing to push for more election reform. But in Pennsylvania, we didn't even get universal mail-in voting until 2020. That was the first election that we had no excuse mail-in voting. Before, you know, you had to have a reason or excuse to vote by mail. So anyway, I'm jealous when you said same-day voter registration. That's something that's been on our policy agenda for years. Hopefully one day it will make it through. But as far as your question specifically, you know, there are a few things that we're doing. And the first thing I would say is the biggest counter to misinformation and disinformation is accurate information. So we have a campaign that we are about to deploy, and it's really about meeting voters where they are. So we are using every method to get information out to voters about how to register to vote, how to cast a ballot, and have it counted. So that includes text messages, radio ads. You know, we have, I'm sure Secretary Way, you're familiar with the Pennsylvania Turnpike, right? We have ads at each of the rest stops on the Turnpike. You know, we are doing digital ads on Facebook and Twitter and different social media platforms. You know, we are really trying to do everything we can to get the accurate information out there so voters are armed with what's true. And I know NAS has a campaign, was it Trusted Info? Because we are the sources as Secretaries of State. Our offices are the sources of accurate and trusted information. So we're doing everything we can. Also, just yesterday, the governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf, signed an executive order expanding voter registration opportunities. So as many of you are probably aware, under the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, there are certain agencies in each state that are required to provide voter registration, and it's called the Motor Voter Law. So a lot of people think of PennDOT in Pennsylvania, or your DMV, wherever you live in your state, and that has to provide an opportunity for people to update their address and register to vote. So there's other agencies like WIC, other agencies that have to provide voter registration, but the governor expanded it to 7 additional agencies. So we included, state parks and Department of Corrections. So as people re-enter society, they have voter registration forms. The veterans' homes are now part of that. So we're really trying to do everything we can to get out registration forms, to get out accurate information and meet voters where they are. Also, when it comes to the threats and supporting counties, we just had a training with our state and federal partners this morning with all 67 counties on insider threats. And I think that's important because a lot of people think of threats as external, but it could also be internal. And a lot of things could be inadvertent or just, mistakes, someone clicking, who's in the election department or in a county, clicking on a ransomware link or phishing link, and then everyone's exposed. So we're really trying to bring resources to the counties, making sure that they are trained on the latest information. And we actually provide office hours with counties every 2 weeks where we're available to answer any questions that they have. We talk through if there's any new court decisions, because there are a lot of court decisions in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of litigation. So rules are constantly changing. So we make ourselves available to make sure counties have guidance.
That's so essential. As you're saying, Secretary Chapman, it's all about meeting the voters where they are, making sure that they are educated and informed. Similar to your outreach, I know it was in 2020, my team and we started the NJ Votes campaign, in which we gathered, not only the necessary accurate information to push out to the locals in hopes that the local election officials then push it out to their constituencies, but just gathering a coalition of trusted voices. We're talking about the faith-based communities. We're talking about your education, your business communities and the like, who meet on a daily basis with your residents and eligible voters within your state. And they too can serve as, that vehicle to have this accurate information to somewhat shatter, if you will, all of that fiction, myths that are going out there about our processes, making sure that voters know who their local election officials are, in addition to the Secretaries of State's office and the Division of Elections. And I know in terms of poll workers, what we decided to do was, make sure that they too engage in the recruitment of poll workers and turn to our pollworker.nj.gov website. But the totality of all of this is that this is indeed a team sport, and we all have to work together. I know we've worked with our law enforcement similar to both of your respective states, so that there can be the confidence for voters to know that their voices will be protected at the ballot box, but at the same time, making sure our board workers understand that, we got your back. We're partnering with the Attorney General's offices, with the FBI, with CISA, DHS, and our Homeland Security. So if there's ever any security concerns, we're here for you. So I have one or two other questions, depending on our time, if I may. Turning back to you, the person, what way does being a woman impact your vision and the path forward that you may see for your office? I'll start with Secretary Bellows.
I think as a woman, and hopefully being, hopefully we'll see the day of the last of the firsts, right? Hopefully we'll stop, we'll burst through all of the barriers of gender. Well, there's so many barriers. I was going to go through the whole list of protected categories. We still have yet to have, well, anyway, sidebar. Back to how it influences me is I think representation matters. So one of the very first thing that I did in my office was redecorate. And instead of portraits of the white male leaders who came before me, I brought portraits of inspirational leaders throughout history that inspired me. So I couldn't bring in a portrait of an African-American or female Secretary of State from the past in Maine, but over my fireplace, I had, first brought in, Frederick Douglass and Congressman John Lewis and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and different trailblazers who came before us and sort of inspire me. And so I've been rotating the portraits at the Secretary of State's office every quarter. And recently an artist gave me a list, and I said, I know this sounds odd, but he suggested a perfectly fine leader. And I said, I know it sounds odd, but I think we have enough white male portraits on Capitol grounds. So no, thank you. And I think representation, and then also recruitment and lifting up the next generation, being supportive of other women running for office, being supportive of other individuals, breaking those barriers and moving forward, and being grateful and recognizing my mentors along the way, and bringing up people and mentoring younger people who are just starting out on their career paths, because I had so many powerful mentors. So that was an inarticulate answer, but I think it is really important that those of us who are the firsts in different ways are bringing out people behind us.
No, it was not inarticulate. It was perfectly stated, especially calling for representation matters. Secretary Chapman?
Yeah, so I wanted to say, outside of my office, there's actually a portrait of C. Dolores Tucker. And C. Dolores Tucker was actually the first African-American woman Secretary of State, and she came from Pennsylvania. So it's such an honor to follow in her footsteps and, be part of a legacy of firsts, in Pennsylvania. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is I'm actually the youngest Secretary of State currently in the nation. So that's another thing that I carry with me is, youth. People look at me all the time and they're saying, you're Secretary of State, at your age. But, as far as your question, I think it's really important that, I'm supporting other women. My senior leadership team, if you look at us, my chief of staff is a woman. I'm a former senator, a former Navy officer. I have a senior advisor who's a woman attorney. I have a lot of women, just really strong women who bring so much to the role at the Department of State on my senior staff. So, it's really important that, our staff is also reflective of our society, and that we are supporting women that are dedicated to democracy and dedicated to, improving access for everyone.
Well, I just love what the two of you have said throughout this entire conversation. And again, going to your words, Secretary Bellows, representation matters is so important. And Secretary Chapman, you're the youngest, so you're really carrying the torch. And it's a good thing that, younger females see this I know I'm not as young as you are, but you know, one of my sheroes, and I think we've had this discussion, Secretary Chapman, was Laura Wooten in New Jersey, who was the longest serving poll worker, and she was African American for 79 years straight, and she did this through the civil rights era. So if she can do it, Miss Wooten can do it, then, you know, all of us too can do it and, you know, continue to be the guardians of our democracy. So I really appreciate each and every one of you. You rock. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Gary.
Thank you so much, all three secretaries. This has been a fascinating discussion. I know it was super informative for those who don't know what secretaries of state do, but also incredibly inspiring. I was so inspired during all of it. So we're going to turn to our audience Q&A now. And I'll do the first one here, and I'm going to take the liberty of combining it with another one that I think goes with it really well. So we've got one question that says, this questioner noticed that all three secretaries here today are Democrats with a fundamental responsibility for elections. And they were wondering, how do you find common ground with your colleagues from more conservative states? And another questioner asked, is there a lot of collaboration, communication between secretaries of state? How does that work? Like, is there one that's the best one, the gold standard? So yeah, just really a question about collaboration and how you work with conservative secretaries of state.
I'll start this off, and I'll, you know, call forth our National Association of Secretaries of State organization, which is nonpartisan, where we convene. We exchange best practices. I know in 2020, when the world changed for all of us, and New Jersey had to become a primarily vote by mail state. That's how we conducted our 2020 election. What my team and I decided to do was consult both aisles, if you will. We consulted the Washington Secretary of State, which was at that time a Republican, former Secretary of State, and then the present Secretary of State and her team out in Colorado, which is Democrat. So, you know, yeah, there always can be different ways of seeing things, but at the end of the day, I think that if you want the best for your constituents, you're always willing to at least hear a different side. I know I have to be nonpartisan because I serve as an appointed Secretary of State. I understand it's under Governor Murphy's leadership as a Democrat. I'm a Democrat. But at the end of the day, as I say to my voters in New Jersey, I want each and every eligible voter to cast their ballot and make sure that it's done fairly and with integrity.
That collaboration at the National Association of Secretaries of State is really important. And the fact that it is bipartisan, so all of the committees have co-chairs, Republicans and Democrats. So I co-chaired the Business Services Committee last year with Secretary of State from Kentucky, Michael Adams, and Kentucky moved forward some voting reforms. Some of them I didn't agree with, but some of them I did agree with. And we can have those conversations about, you know, what different states are doing and what they're doing well, and learn from each other. And it's very civil and very collaborative. And that's been very refreshing, just given that so often in politics, unfortunately, we're seeing the dehumanization of the other side tied up with a big lie.
Yeah, and you know, I've only been in the role for since January, so I'm still figuring out certain things. And I call on, you know, Secretary Way, Secretary Bellows, you know, just for strategic questions about how I should be doing something as a new Secretary of State, also collaborating with everyone. So it's wonderful that so many secretaries have been open to be mentors, to also give guidance. But, you know, there are a lot of states that are dealing with the same issues right now. Nationally. So we often speak with one another, talk about, you know, what they're seeing in their states, what best practices we can bring to our states, if there's any shared challenges, how we're sharing information so we can address similar concerns.
Thank you so much, all of you. The next question is actually a really great segue into this question, I think, from what you were all speaking about, which is that given that elections should be overseen and administered in a nonpartisan manner, the questioner has heard some calls for Secretary of State positions to be nonpartisan, and they are wondering what your thoughts about that are. Are there any institutional ways or statutory reforms that would keep politics out of election oversight, especially given some sort of recent politicization of the job?
Well, I can say that, I can't speak for how another state would want to govern. I just know that the election process to me is one of an administrative function. I think sometimes there's the political part that gets tossed into the administration and implementation of how our elections work. I use the example of online voter registration. That is a means, a policy decision to expand folks' access to registration in the ballot box. However, the building up and building out of online voter registration, I know when we were doing it, I think it was in 2020. We did so much doing it. It's like a blur. But when we actually launched it, I had to sit down pre-launch with those who are bureaucrats, those who are cyber experts. And that has nothing to do with whatever political cap that I'm wearing. So I believe that it's a state's decision. I just know that administrating and implementing these various aspects of our election process really is just a function, if you will.
Secretary Bellows, Secretary Chapman, do you have any thoughts on that? If not, we could move on to another question quickly.
I think the job is nonpartisan, even if the role and the candidacies are not, if that makes sense. Just what Secretary Way was just saying, I think the job has to, by its nature, be a nonpartisan job. You are conducting free, fair, and secure elections for everyone to participate. We just passed legislation to create a new post-election audit and training team. Maine was one of 3 states that didn't have post-election audits. We're glad to change that. But we wrote into the law a requirement that the staff be nonpartisan, because Maine has a tradition in our legislature of having nonpartisan policy staff the legislature. And so we decided to make that a provision of the audit and training staff.
I would just say, I think it's unfortunate that making sure that all eligible voters want to have the means to cast a ballot has become partisan. That really shouldn't be anything that's viewed as partisan. Making sure that we have an inclusive democracy shouldn't be something that's viewed as partisan. So I think it's important that these roles are nonpartisan. And, in my role as an appointed Secretary of State, similar to Secretary Way, although I'm a Democrat and I'm appointed by a Democrat, I have to make sure I'm governing myself in a nonpartisan way. And the majority of the counties in Pennsylvania are not Democrat counties. They're Republican counties run by Republican commissioners and what have you. So, I think it's important that these roles are considered to be nonpartisan, and that's something that people are thinking about.
Thank you. And I think we have time for probably one last quick question and before we have to close things out. Unfortunately, I wish we could continue this for quite some time, but we know you're all extremely busy. And that question is, how concerned are you about people who may be signing up to be election officials or election workers with some sort of malicious intent, maybe to sabotage results or that sort of thing? I guess the question is, are you concerned about that? And if so, how much? I'll call on Secretary Chapman, or Secretary Bellows is ready to answer. Great.
Well, I was thinking about Secretary Chapman's training today and the insider threat training, and I was like, oh, we should do that in Maine. I think we have been encouraging people that have questions about how elections are administered to volunteer as poll workers, because under Maine law, our volunteer poll workers have to be equally represented from both major political parties, Democratic and Republican. And volunteering at the polls on election day can be a great way to see firsthand how our elections work. I think we've been very welcoming and open in issuing that invitation. In Maine, you have to be a registered voter and you have to be a resident of the county in the polling place in which you're volunteering. So those are sort of the checks and balances there. But I've been thinking about Secretary Chapman's training, and it's just one of several ideas I've written down in the last hour, or mentally written down in the last hour to use.
And I'm happy to share, we worked with CISA, FBI, everybody on that training. But, as I mentioned, there's always a risk, right? You always have a risk that there could be an insider threat anywhere from poll worker to county level. But what's important is that we're training county officials and election officials to be able to spot it. And also, if they think anything nefarious is happening, to be able to report that and to get the tools in order to report that. So that's, a part of our training, and we're going to continue that as we move forward as well.
Yeah, I want to just echo the sentiments. We always want to be proactive instead of reactive. And even if it's a small percentage of a chance of occurring, you still want to have your eyes wide open and ensure that all layers of election workers and the like are aware of situational awareness, if you will, of anything that can occur. I know, on a separate note, that's why we had in New Jersey the tabletop exercises in 2019 with 14 state delegations, federal government, etc. And, I applaud Secretary Chapman with the insider training that recently occurred on her end too, because everything, as Secretaries of State, we want to make certain that all of the buckets and boxes are checked, and making sure that our elections run securely and safely.
Thank you so much. And I know that voters in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Maine are sounds like they're in very good hands. That is bringing us to the hour. So I want to thank all three of you again, Secretary Way, Secretary Chapman, and Secretary Bellows, for your time. I also want to thank again our sponsors, Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, and Rockefeller Brothers Fund, for your support on these very critical issues. And I want to provide just one more reminder to keep an eye out for the launch of the Women Saving Democracy platform on September 20th. You'll be able to access this recording, the one from yesterday with Attorneys General, the essay series, and episodes of the Ms. Studios podcast on the issues with Michelle Goodwin and 15 Minutes of Feminism. We'll also follow up with links for promoting on social media. Thank you all so much for joining us, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.